You made it to church this Sunday. Great job. Yeah, praise God. And I'll give you a round of applause. You made it to church. You don't have to do it. Just receive this, okay? Just receive that. You made it through. I know Greg Glotzbach, our children's check-in guy, he got here at the first service. Right before the first service started, he was stuck in his driveway for an hour. And he worked and he got out. And we're thankful for that. And that's just one guy. A lot of you made it through the snow. And I actually, in between services, I was looking at social media and I saw a bunch of pictures of roads around here that were bad, and so a lot of people aren't able to be here. I'm thankful that you're here because I'm really excited to kick off our walk through the book of Daniel together. So we start a new series today, book of Daniel. So if you got your Bibles or device, go to Daniel chapter 1. That's where we're going to be, and I love this book of Daniel. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible, and I'm so pumped up to be going verse by verse through this for the next few months together. And if you went to Sunday school, spent any time in Sunday school, you learned some stories from Daniel. We're a small enough group, audience participation. What are some stories you learned from the book of Daniel? Daniel and the lion's den. Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. God protects him. What else? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's right, Daniel chapter 3. And they have a choice. You're going to stand up for God or not? And we're going to study that. Anything else? The writing on the wall. Good. Yeah, it's a little lesser known story, but that's toward the end of the book of Daniel. And that's a miraculous thing when Daniel's an old man and he still is used by God. Today we're going to see that he's a young man used by God. And we're going to be talking about living life for God in a godless place. And just to give you a heads up, too, small groups are starting again, and this is a perfect time for you to join small groups. What we do at small groups here at Village is that we study the text the week before it's preached. And so the group started this past week, and, well, some of them did. Mine didn't because of the snow. But you get together, you talk about the text, you work with it, and then you're ready to go on Sunday morning. And I love it because I get to learn from my group. I get to start wrestling with it, and then it helps me prepare for Sunday morning. And I think you'll be blessed by that study of God's Word in a small group too. And Daniel has everything, okay? Daniel's got it all. It's got history. It's got drama. The stories that you've already talked about, they're there and they're filled with drama. There's prophecy. A big chunk of it's going to be prophecy, and we're going to talk about that the second half of the book of Daniel. And then, of course, as the sermon bumper showed, it's really all about God's sovereignty, that God is in control. God's in control of all the kingdoms of the world. God's in control of all the kings and queens and the powers that be. They're not the ultimate authority or power. God is, and God is on the throne, and we see how God watches over his people as they go into exile, and that's what we're going to start with before we get to point number 1, with a little bit of history as we start with Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. Okay, you ready? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels from the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Stop right there. So Babylon was the power of the world at that time. They were the rulers of the ancient Near East, and they were a ruthless people, no doubt about it. They would conquer a city like they conquered Jerusalem here, and many times they would put the heads of their enemies on stakes and surround the city with these stakes of people to show how ruthless and how powerful they are. And you can't dare stand against the power of the Babylonians. And You see in the Bible, you also see a reference to Chaldeans, and they're kind of used interchangeably, but the Chaldeans were specifically from southern Babylon, and they were people that were known for their ruthlessness. Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean, and they were also known for their ability to think, and they were smart. And so what made them so good at what happened here in Jerusalem and to Israel is that they knew how to conquer a kingdom. And so they came into Jerusalem, they besieged it. Jerusalem fell 597 BC. This is historical. And the city fell, and it came under the power of the Babylonians, and they killed a ton of people. I don't know how many exactly, but many people were wiped out by the Babylonians. But then, did you see in the text? Verse 3, the king brought some of the people back to Babylon from Jerusalem, from Israel. Nobility, youths with good appearance, skillful, able to think, some of the best that were left over that weren't killed. And so what Babylon would do, what the Babylonians would do, is they would bring people in from the lands that they conquered, and they would train them to be a Babylonian. Like Daniel here, he's probably 16, 17, 18 years old, and they would train him to be a Babylonian. Then they would take them and send them back into one of the lands that they conquered as a Babylonian, and then they would propagate the language and literature and religion, the culture of the Babylonians. By the way, that's what they did here in Israel as well. And they took some people that they had conquered from somewhere else, and they brought them and they inserted them back into Israel, and those people intermarried with some of the people that were left over, and they produced the Samaritans. And you see 600 years after this, Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman. She is a descendant from the Babylonian process of conquering kingdoms right here in 597 BC, Daniel chapter 1. I jotted this down, see if you think this is true. The question that we must ask ourselves is the same as Daniel. It's this: how are God's people going to live in a godless culture amongst a godless people? That's the question. How is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going to live among these people? So they're brought in. Daniel and his friends are brought. They have good appearance. They're skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge. They're understanding. They have learning, and they're competent to stand in the king's palace. Here's my first point. I think you'll see it. First, God's people have to live with discernment. We have to live with discernment. Look at what they were taught. They were to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. And among those were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Daniel and his friends had to live with discernment, specifically discernment in 3 different areas. The first area is what is called ideology. Ideology. You noticed it there, verse 5. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Part of their programming, part of their instruction was to learn what it meant to be a Babylonian. What their history looked like, what their gods looked like, what they did on a day-to-day basis, how they interacted with people, how they marked the days, how they had a calendar. By the way, the Babylonians were a smart people. For 4 centuries at this time, for 4 centuries, they had mapped out the heavens and the stars. They were astrologers and astronomers, and it's no wonder that 600 years later, people from this area came to follow the star over Bethlehem to find Jesus. And so Daniel and his buddies are part of this programming, and they're learning. This is a cultural center. Babylon was an important bastion of culture and learning and programming for these young men. They had to live with discernment. The second area you see is the area of idolatry. Idolatry. For them, it was the king's table. Verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. Now, the king's food would consist of food that was sacrificed to idols. And for the Israelite, for the Hebrew, that is against God's law, against God's command. They'd have to be discerning. They have to be thinking about the things that they actually ate as it related to their faith, as it related to who they were as a people of God. Then the third section was their identity. They were given new names. Daniel means my judge is God. His new name, Belshazzar, means Bel protects his life, Bel being one of the gods of the Babylonians. Hananiah means Yahweh has shown grace. He was changed to Shadrach, which means the command of Aku, another god. Mishael, his name means who is like God. He was given the name Meshach, which means who is like Aku. Azariah, his name means Yahweh helps. He was given the name Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. They were given new names. They were assigned a new identity. That it was critical that these young men live with discernment. We are being programmed as well. We are being programmed. And you might be thinking, well, I can just get by on life and not be affected with the things around me. I'm a strong-willed person. I'm not going to be impacted by the world around me. And Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, do not be transformed or do not be conformed to this world any longer, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's a conforming that happens whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. We must be discerning about the world in which we live, that it's going to shape us into its image, not into the image of God, the image of Christ, no, into its own image. It's got its own program. When I first preached this message from Daniel chapter 1, I love Daniel, and I preached it like almost 20 years ago. And I look back at it, and part of this illustration that I had for being programmed, for being taught this ideology of our culture, the ideology that we live in, was what I did was, and I'll try it with you even though it's really outdated now, okay? I did this. I said, 588 2300. Yes, you all know that. We're all programmed, and we know that stupid song. And I can even see the guy, his face on there. And you know what? The TV's outdated now. TV's nothing. Back then, TV was a thing, blaring to you. You could have it on all the time, and it was talking about the world system and the ideology of the world, and it was changing people's minds and thoughts, and you had to be careful about that. But, oh man, those days were nothing compared to the days that we live in today. Because of the power of technology, now we're inundated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with the culture, the godless culture that seeks to conform us to its pattern of thinking. Media of all kinds, mainstream media, social media, everything that we consume, there's a program to it, and it's not God's. It is the devil's. It is the world's. The attention grabbing, the constant dopamine hitting things that we have in our possession that would seek to shape us into its image. Don't be fooled. We must live with discernment as God's people in a world of sin. We're challenged in the same way with our ideology. Also, our identity is challenged. You're a Christian? Okay, let me redefine what a Christian means. A Christian means that you're pretty much a backwoods, socially awkward weirdo. Okay, you're a Christian, you're probably a bigot, you're most likely an extremist, you're probably racist. That's the redefining of what a Christian is by the world's standard, and then in order to write you off and to not hear you. Why would the world want to hear truth? And so the identity, by the way, that's what cults do all the time. They change people's names. You come into this group, okay, we're going to give you a new name. Forget about that. The world seeks to do that too. You're a Christian? Well, here's what a Christian is. In idolatry. Idolatry is everywhere. Anything that would take the place of God. The commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And we're going to follow God, and yet there are so many gods, small g, that want to take his place, with the number one being ourselves. So Daniel and his friends, they have to live with discernment. They have to decide what to do with their program, the things that are coming to them. And so look back at the story now, verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. God's people have to live with determination. Determination. Daniel, he resolved not to commit idolatry. He said, okay, the language and literature of the Babylonians, I can do that. I can go to class. I can believe it. I know the truth. I know the history of what we believe as the nation of Israel and the people of God, and Yahweh is God, but you can teach me. Okay, I'll learn that stuff. You can even change my name. I know in my heart who I am, and so, but you can call me whatever you want. Okay, fine. But this thing I will not do. This thing I will not do because God commands me as one of his people not to commit adultery, to not participate in that which was given to idols. And I'm going to be resolved. Daniel is resolved. Some of your translations say purposed in his heart. He was determined, or he decided, or he made up his mind not to do that thing. Have you made up your mind to, number one, not do certain things, and number two, to do certain things? That's a wise thing to do, to be determined to live a certain way. And so let me just give you an example, okay? 3 things not to do. Maybe you decided this. Here's 3 things not to do as God's people. You could decide, number 1, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to lie. Lying is the language of the devil. And therefore, I'm not going to speak that way. Because my Father is not the devil. My Father is God. And so I'm going to speak the truth. Now, there's certain consequences to that. Because sometimes I will not want to speak the truth because it will reveal the sin that I have in my life. Or it will reveal the thing that is wrong with me. But if I resolve to always tell the truth, that will actually act as an accountability for the way that I live, because I know that I'm going to have to answer to my husband. I'm going to have to answer to my wife. I'm going to have to answer to my mom and dad. I'm going to have to speak, because I'm going to speak the truth. And I resolve to do it. I don't care if it gets me in trouble, because then if it gets me in trouble, I deserve it. But I'm going to speak the truth. How about this one? Number 2, I'm not going to gossip. I'm not going to gossip. Man, I love to have information that nobody else has. I love to get it first. Love to hold on to that information. And I love it when I'm not feeling so good about myself, and when the spotlight comes on me and my problems, I like that I can talk about somebody else and their problems, and that makes me feel better. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to gossip. I'm going to think the best about other people. I'm going to talk the best about other people. I'm going to encourage another. I'm going to talk a different way. How about this? I'm not going to lust. I'm not going to lust. Now we're made with certain attractions, and we're thankful for that, and in the right parameters, it's a beautiful thing. But I'm going to resolve. I'm going to be determined. I'm going to make up my mind that I'm not going to give in to the trap of pornography. I'm not going to give in to the ideology that's at my fingertips, that I can have pleasure at any moment, at any time, any place I want. And it might be such a pattern of your life. It's just a daily thing. You haven't even thought about it anymore, but maybe you're going to wake up and think that, hey, it is a good thing to be resolved, to be determined, to live for the Lord. And I'm going to battle against this temptation. And we have a series starting here this month for purity, for people to pursue purity. There's tools, there's help, there's things to do in this area of life, and there's accountability for your phone, and there's things you can do. But you got to be determined. You got to resolve. You got to make up your mind. Think about these things. This is what a Christian must do. God's people living in a godless culture amongst godless people must be resolved, determined to live for God. So those are 3 things not to do, but I got to be positive. So how about 3 things to do? 3 things to do. I'm going to love. 1 John 4:7-8. Beloved, let us love one another. For love is of God, and everyone that loves is born of God and knows God. But he that does not love does not know God. And beloved, let us love one another. And so we are called to love one another. So I'm going to love my family, even when it's hard. I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to love and pray even for my enemy, the ones that persecute me. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to be resolved to do this. How about this? Second one. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to forgive others. I'm not going to hold the grudge. I'm not going to give the devil, an enemy, a foothold. I'm going to forgive my husband. I'm going to forgive my wife. I'm going to forgive my friend. I'm going to practice forgiveness because I've received forgiveness from God for me. And since I've been forgiven, how can I withhold forgiveness from anybody else? I've been forgiven for all my sins because Jesus died for me. Jesus died in my place. He paid the punishment of my sin, and I embrace that truth by faith. It changes my life. It changes the way that I live, and I'm going to forgive others. And you know that the grace of God is so big and the forgiveness is so great that even if I fail at what we're talking about today, my determination doesn't strengthen me, I falter and fail, there's forgiveness still. Because we're not saved by how good we live in this godless culture. We're saved by how good Christ lived for us on our behalf. And since I'm forgiven by his grace freely, I'm going to forgive others in the same way. God's people live with determination. Last thing we see here is that God's people live with dedication. With dedication. The first step is that he had to go to the guy that was in charge of him. Look back at verse 8, second part. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. He's like, if I allow you not to eat this food, they're going to see that you're not as healthy as the guys that are eating the food, and then I'm going to be on the hook for it. Evidently, they didn't understand diet very, very much then. They had this understanding that the king's food was the best, it was the most healthy, and what's going to happen to me? Verse 11, then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Here's God's people have to live with dedication. Dedication. It wasn't just enough that Daniel was determined to do that which was right. He had to follow through and actually do it. He had to take 10 days of eating a terrible diet, if you ask me, okay? And how many people are thankful God doesn't require us just to eat vegetables and water? Anybody, an amen? A lot of vegetarians here. Okay, good. But God doesn't require that for us, but he had to do it. Daniel had to do it. He had to go. First, he had to ask. He could have gotten in trouble for asking, but he had to ask, and he did ask. And then he had to say, okay, give me 10 days. And then he had to do it for 10 days. How many people want to just eat vegetables and water for 10 days, and he had to be dedicated to do it? I hate diets, and it's hard to do. Everybody's got a New Year's resolution come January 1st, but to be dedicated, to actually see it through is another thing. You have to follow through. He actually had to do it. One of my mentors in seminary, his name was George Sweeting. He always said this: the road marked good intentions leads to a town called never. Good intentions never gets to the place that you need to go. It's actually following through. Let me tell you about Glenn Cunningham. Glenn Cunningham was born in 1909. When he was 8 years old, there was a fire in the school that he went to, a schoolhouse. They had fires back then a lot more often than today. And his older brother, Floyd, died in the fire. Glenn was severely burned. His lower body was severely burned. From his thighs down, all of his skin was burned off. It was a terrible, terrible scene. The doctors and the people that took him into the hospital, they recommended to his parents that he have both of his legs amputated. And he was so distressed and so distraught, and his parents were so broken they couldn't bring themselves to follow the doctor's recommendations of taking off his legs. It took him 2.5 years until he tried to start walking. And little by little he was able to walk. His parents would take turns day by day massaging his legs, and Glenn began to be able to run again. And he was dedicated. He was going to get to a place that the doctors never told him he could get to, and he did. He went on to become the world record holder of the mile run. Did it in 4 minutes and 6 seconds. He was part of the 1936 Olympic Games. He is today a member of the Kansas Hall of Fame, Kansas Sports Hall of Fame. Glenn had great faith in God. His favorite verse was Isaiah 40:31. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Glenn Cunningham died in 1988. He had determination, but not only that, he had dedication to follow through. Daniel followed through. Look back at the story. There's verse 15. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh. English Standard Version is my Bible, fatter in flesh. It doesn't mean that they were fatter, literally like we would say fat. It means that they were healthier, okay, than all the youths who ate the king's food. Verse 16. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Daniel made a lot of friends that day. Verse 17, as for those 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. The end of the story ends in victory. And they lived with discernment. They were among a godless people. Then they were resolved. They were determined not to sin against God. And then they lived out their faith. They lived it out every day circumstances of life. Now, for the person who trusts in Christ, for the Christian, for the person who's a believer, who lives this type of a life, there is victory for you. There's a coming victory. This is not a prosperity message that you're going to experience the blessing like Daniel did. No, I'm not saying that. You might experience the ridicule that this world can bring. You might experience punishment and death for this. But in the end, the ultimate victory is with God. And if you stand for God, if you're dedicated to His ways, there is a blessing in that. Whether in this life or in the life to come, you are on the right side of history. You are on the truth side of life. You are on the righteous and justice and holy side of living. Daniel and his friends followed through, and they were blessed by God. And so as you go today to live in a godless place amongst a godless people, believe in Jesus, trust in Him, and live for Him. Be careful of the things that you live and consume. Make up your mind to do some things and not to do other things. And then when you do that, live it as hard as you can. Now, when you fail and when you fall, because you will, thank God that His grace is big enough to pick you back up and to get you back on the path of living for him.